Humans are rational creatures. Many of us rarely deviate from the path once we've started. We are predictable and largely consistent. In other words, you are a creature of habit. You've likely heard this famous quote from Aristotle before. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. But what if the very thing said to make you excellent is what's holding you and your business back from the pinnacle of greatness, or from simply making your next 100,000? It's easy to get comfortable. It's easy to sit on the couch all day watching Netflix, even though you know you should be doing something else. It's easy to rely on old products, even when changing them would mean bigger growth. The truth is that the more successful you become, the harder it is actually to change. The more money you make, the more accustomed to a certain lifestyle you become. The more employees you have, the slower your decision making. In the Book of Five Rings, Miyamoto Musashi, a great Japanese swordsman, philosopher, and strategist, shared his insights on confrontation and victory. In the book, he writes, "What is big is easy to perceive. What is small is difficult to perceive. In short, it's difficult for large numbers of men to change position, so their movements can be easily predicted. An individual can easily change his mind, so his movements are difficult to predict." The Book of Five Rings is a prized study companion for any martial artist, but the wisdom and philosophy can be applied in business, a world that also requires much strategy and skill. This lesson has 3 essential stepping stones told by combining the ancient wisdom of Miyamoto Musashi and the business acumen of the late tech innovator Steve Jobs. We will cover the art of timing, innovation, and action. There is, however, a hidden 4th step that completes them. See if you can guess what it is. I will reveal what it is at the end. So how do you turn the tides of momentum in your favor, and why are some people able to do it so easily? How can you change the habits that may be holding you back? Let's get into it. Whether you love him or hate him, Steve Jobs was the master of pivoting in a new direction, and although he ran a large company with thousands of employees, he was able to make decisions and change directions at the drop of a dime, making Apple, as Miyamoto Musashi says, difficult to predict. Many well-known tech inventions had a predecessor. Google Earth had TerraVision, video games had Pong, and the iPhone had the Simon Personal Communicator. Yes, what is widely agreed to be the first smartphone was actually created in 1992, a year before the World Wide Web was open to the public and a decade and a half before Steve Jobs debuted the iPhone. The Simon was invented by Frank Canova Jr., an engineer at IBM. It was intuitive, had a touchscreen, and an easy-to-navigate home screen filled with icons, games, apps, internet access, email, GPS, and stock quotes. It had what made most smartphones today so useful, except nobody remembers the Simon, and everybody and their mother knows and uses the iPhone. So what happened, and how is it relevant to your ability to change directions? Miyamoto Musashi writes, "There is timing in everything. There is timing in the whole life of the warrior, in his thriving and declining, in his harmony and discord. Similarly, there is timing in the way of the merchant, in the rise and fall of capital." He goes on to say that the timing itself cannot be mastered without practice, and that being able to understand the rhythm is essential. The Simon was the right idea at the wrong time. People simply weren't ready for it. In 1992, the cloud didn't even exist. The book, The One Device by Brian Merchant, shares that hard drives were too big to fit in the handset, and many of the apps couldn't be included on the machine itself. The plan was to create a system to support add-on cards that would plug in and enable functionalities like GPS. Although that sounds like an old school app store, the technology of the day had to catch up to the revolutionary idea. It was bulky, and the thought of having to plug and unplug cards every time you wanted to do something sounded more like a hassle than a convenience. This is essentially one of the problems innovators face. Present something too early and nobody gets it. Present something too late and the wave has passed. Frank Canova Jr. may have invented the first smartphone, but in his own words, the technologies just barely allowed him to make the phone, which kept on crashing. Now, fast forward to the unveiling of the iPhone. January 9th, 2007, Steve Jobs stood on stage at Macworld San Francisco and said,
"But what we're going to do is get rid of all these buttons and just make a giant screen. A giant screen."
The crowd cheered in excitement. The market had some context of what was to come, as the technology had evolved and phones like the BlackBerry Curve Nokia N95 and Samsung Blackjack were already in use. The timing was impeccable, and not only that, Jobs had stood by Apple's motive of being insanely great. He made sure that the momentum was on an upward swing while the product was so intuitive, even a child could use it. When talking about the phones being used at the time, Jobs said, "While the first invention, the Simon, may have been unveiled too quickly with complicated technology, Apple chose to release the iPhone once it had removed the barriers and obstacles of use through extreme innovation and craftsmanship. It was a product people had to say yes to." In 2010 at the D8 conference, Jobs shared his philosophy on timing and rhythm when it came to business and technology. By 2014, Wall Street analysts had identified the iPhone to be the world's most profitable product, beating even the highly addictive and excessively advertised Marlboro cigarettes. Page 12, the One device. And by 2016, Horace Dedew, a tech industry analyst and Apple expert, shared that the iPhone had sold over 1 billion devices, saying it was the best-selling phone, music player, video screen, camera, and computer of all time. But how did we get here? That takes us to our next lesson: innovation. What holds most individuals and companies back from truly excelling is that they fail to stay innovative. They begin taking things for granted, thinking that what worked in the past will always work in the future. But the future is long, unpredictable, and always changing. Miyamoto Musashi writes, "With water as the basis, the spirit becomes like water. Water adopts the shape of its receptacle. It is sometimes a trickle and sometimes a wild sea." By holding on too tightly to our habits, we become stagnant, stale, and cannot flow like water, innovating over time. Apple has a history of innovation. Since the beginning, they wanted to make something different. Before the iPhone, Apple had been working on the iPad and the iPod. At the time, tablets used stylus pens and the iPod didn't have a touchscreen. Instead, it had a circular button that allowed users to choose music, and it looked reminiscent of the old rotary phones. Although some devices had resistive touchscreens like ATM machines, the user design wasn't fluid and often meant having to press hard onto the screen to make anything happen. There was no way of simply swiping your fingers across the screen or pinching to expand an image like we have today. Former Apple software engineer Scott Forstall told the Computer History Museum some of the behind-the-scenes emotions that may have fueled the innovation. Jobs himself confirmed some of the story. Steve wanted to make something truly revolutionary. For several years, starting in 1993, after Jobs had been publicly fired from his own company, Apple had the Newton, which was a series of personal digital assistants or palm stylus that offered handwriting recognition. In 1998, a year after Jobs returned to the company, the Newton was discontinued. Apple was on a new wave of reinvention. Jobs had even fought to win over and hire Bas Ording, a UI developer, now famous for the iPhone's iconic scrolling rubber band effect. Ording had traveled to Silicon Valley and met with a few companies. One was Apple and the other was Meta Creations. At the time, Meta Creations was doing some really cool things with user experiences. So when he was offered the job at Apple, he was hesitant. Ording did end up joining the Apple Human Interface team, and it was there that the group started brainstorming about multi-touch, a functionality that allowed touchscreen to register multiple points of contact made on the surface simultaneously. The group would meet once per week to exchange ideas and work on a prototype that they could interact with. Around that time, Tina Huang, a software engineer at Apple, bought a Fingerworks trackpad to help with her wrist pain. When some of the designers saw her using it, they were intrigued. Apple would end up buying the company, allowing for the pinch and zooming gestures of the touch interfaces. The assignment for the team was to work on an iPad type of screen. Jobs said he wanted a sheet of glass that he could read his emails on. They started to explore the idea of an on-screen keyboard, something that would allow the user to type and interact with their emails. The team was focused on creating a new kind of tablet and on the verge of inventing a handheld device that would rock the communications world. In the book of 5 Rings, it is written, "In all forms of strategy, it is necessary to maintain the combat stance in everyday life and to make your everyday stance your combat stance." In this way, a warrior is both always relaxed and ready to take action. Without the courage of conviction and the ability to take action when the time was right, the decision to create the iPhone may have never happened. When asked which came first, Jobs divulged the truth. It had been Bas Ording that had created the rubber band inertia. The screen would bounce up like a ball once the user had reached the bottom of the screen. And so touchscreens, swiping locks, intuitive apps, and more were created. Before the iPhone's existence, there was no app market like we have today. The phone carriers themselves were the ones to decide what would be on the phone. In Jobs' own words, the iPhone was the first to have a new relationship with the carrier that said, "You worry about the network, we'll worry about what's on the phone." Apple had found a way to create and sell the phone the way they wanted, to define it in the way they wanted, and to have the kind of control that would allow them to completely dominate the market for personal communication devices. In other words, they changed the rules of the game. This was done carefully by overseeing every part of the process, especially the carrier. Jobs had first approached Verizon Wireless. Ivan Seidenberg, the former chairman and CEO of Verizon, remembered Jobs being concerned with features like voicemail. He was worried that when making a call, users could only answer their voicemails in the order in which they came onto the phone. Jobs wanted users to be able to skip over certain voicemails or go back to others. Verizon, on the other hand, wanted Apple to use their CDMA-based network, which covered the United States. The answer was no. Verizon was certain that Apple wanted to go international and would choose a global system for mobile communications, launching a GSM smartphone. It was AT&T that finally agreed to work with Apple and launched the first iPhone in 2007. From concept to forming the right team to convincing AT&T to help the first iPhone go global, it all required an extreme level of action and follow-through. There was no resting on old habits simply for the sake of consistency. What's the last massive form of action you've taken in your life or business? And finally, the unspoken rule that binds the rest together, the one that all success rests upon. In the Book of Five Rings, Miyamoto Musashi conveys an important message. The way of the warrior is to study the strategy daily, to go the distance, and to be prepared to give oneself over to the fight. How ready are you to overcome the habits that hold you back? How obsessed are you with leaving your mark on the world? It was that same focus that not only left Jobs preoccupied with the outer look and feel of the product, but the inner workings and aesthetics of them as well. In the book, The One Device, Merchant writes, "Have you ever tried to pry open your iPhone to open it up and look inside? Apple would rather you didn't. One of the ways it became the most profitable corporation on the planet is by keeping us out of the morgue." Jobs told his biographer that allowing people to tinker with his designs would just allow people to screw things up. Thus, the iPhones are sealed with proprietary screws that make it impossible to open your own phone without a special tool. It was the obsession that allowed him to say no to certain features and commit to a single mission: to be insanely great and to put customer satisfaction above all else. By keeping the mission of having a great product above entering into a nasty battle with the competition, Jobs was able to avoid decisions that could have hurt the legacy and longevity of the brand itself. For example, when Google began competing with the iPhone by creating the Android T-Mobile G1, he didn't remove any of the features attributed to Google, like Maps or Search from the iPhone. He knew that users would want and need those things. Jobs' response was simply, "We want to make a better product than they do. That's what we're about. We're about better products." But just because you're competing with someone doesn't mean you have to be rude. User experience always came first. Finally, in 2005, during his famous Stanford University commencement speech, he shared the news of his first cancer diagnosis. Over the remaining 6 years of his life, he would innovate until the end, speaking to the Cupertino City Council about buying the land from then dwindling Hewlett-Packard business to create the new Apple campus. The old campus, named the Infinite Loop, was quickly becoming too small as the company had started renting buildings in an expanding radius away from the original location. The new campus would be large enough to fit the company's need to sit directly along Interstate 280, making it accessible to employees. It was as if the act of seeing the company through to its next phase was his way of saying goodbye. It was his way of ensuring Apple would have a future. Through both the wisdom of the warrior and the wisdom of the innovator, we can begin to see the roots of our own habits that may need shaking. What are you afraid to change? Instead of worrying about the worst outcome, try to flip the question around. What is the best that could happen? What is the best possible outcome? It just might mean making the best-selling mobile device in the world. History is full of companies, kingdoms, and people that stopped growing and instead slowly went out of business, lost power, or lost relevancy. What will it take for you to learn from their mistakes? Steve Jobs was one of the few leaders to not only be able to make the challenging decision to pivot, but convince an entire company to pivot along with him. Perhaps your business doesn't have 1,000 employees, but if it's going to have a future, it will need to evolve, and evolution often has growing pains. When you look at your business, Are you committed to doing whatever needs to be done, or are you going to be chained back by the comfort of consistency? In many ways, changing your mind is the most powerful thing that you can do. In closing, study carefully the art of timing, innovation, action, and obsession with a chosen mission, and you will find your own path to victory.